Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think, like everyone else, I've been really looking forward to this conference for a long time. So thank you so much for organizing this and for the introduction. So the project I will speak about today is entitled Punctuated Land. It actually is a project that just started in 2019. So in a way, way back when we kind of thought of this conference, it was just kind of starting. So I will focus on that and the work that led to it. So let's see if this works.
Okay, let me start it.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I just wanted to share that when preparing this presentation, I was very much, I think like many in this room, affected by the recent events in Israel, Palestine, where this project took place. And I really asked myself where to begin, how to open up this presentation. And especially while I'm observing from afar what is taking place in my home country, in Israel, Palestine. So I wanted to start actually with acknowledging that, with the sense of mourning, as I mourn the devastating loss of Palestinian and Israeli lives in and around Gaza. My heart breaks in face of the endless cycle of brutal violence that we are witnessing. I find myself grieving at the sound of divisive language and violent rhetoric, particularly in my home country. I was born in Jerusalem. I now live in London. My mind is trapped in thoughts about the hostages in Gaza and the brutal loss of entire families in Israel and in far greater numbers in Gaza, and this is an unfolding situation. These events demand that we examine our humanity, or at least I would like to think, if there's sort of a hopeful note in what we are experiencing now, that maybe it will turn us to sort of re-examine our humanity, and especially where we want to go from here, not as us and them that I hear so loudly spoken, but rather as women, as humans, and as me and you. In the compass of mourning, written after Hamas's brutal attacks on the 7th of October and the brutal bombardment of Gaza by the State of Israel that followed, Judith Butler opened by writing that the matters most in need of public discussion are those that are difficult to discuss within the framework now available to us. Although one wishes to go directly to the matter at hand, one bumps up against the limits of a framework that makes it nearly impossible to say what one has to say. In many ways, this has been the case with regards to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a long time, and has materialized in my practice as the motivation to explore ways of unlearning or undoing these frameworks through photography. In light of such violence, I fear standing here today and found comfort in the words of Audre Lorde, who wrote, and I quote, "I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood." Her greatest regrets, she admitted, were her silences. She continued, "Of course I am afraid, because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and that always seems fraught with danger." Audre Lorde turns to poetry, and I turn to photography in search of these moments of self-revelation, moments that will speak when words are so difficult to find. The still image, the silent image, became my companion, my refuge. Can there be dialogue across and through what appears to be insurmountable disagreements, layered on unimaginable pain, suffering, and loss? I can't really answer this today, but I turn to photography and how it enabled me to transform silence into quietness. And the quiet image speaks loudly through the layers I will unpack in this presentation. In the desert landscape, a sudden appearance of a line in the sky is captured on film. An obscure circle is carried by the wind, stretching nearer until it loses its shape entirely. These are traces of human presence in the landscape. The body of my camera is held at waist level and raised towards my abdomen so that I can see better. To photograph I look away from the landscape and down into the body. I hold my breath as I press the release button. Despite the genres of landscape photography and conflict having predominantly been framed by the practices of male photographers, there is something rather feminine I find in my Hasselblad camera. A symmetrical 6x6 frame and body, a dark chamber, a womb, are where light penetrates to draw an image. I often wonder what kind of stillness and absence resides there. In the work maneuvers, I used my camera and my body, shifting my position in the landscape to draw a circle, contemplating the relationship between drawing and photography, and drawing and the actions that leave marks on the ground. Human exploits of the land, militarization, settlement, and traces of displacement that this desert landscape invokes. Speculating of the nature of the traces in front of me, who made them and for what purpose, are questions that arise for me in the landscape and in front of photographs. These observations might call upon interpretations that are informed by prior knowledge about this place, a form of seeing that is already informed by conflict and partakes in its discourse and its experience. The landscape of Israel-Palestine have been historically envisioned by the Western and Zionist imaginary as barren and desolate. This vision haunts the representation of the land still. And I think it was really a pleasure to hear Janan speak earlier and bring that into sort of a sharper focus and contextualization. So thank you, Janan. And this work, I think, has been hugely inspired by your work as well. So it's a real pleasure to be together in the same conference. In my practice, I aim to make visible the presence of people not by direct representation, but rather through weaving together the human traces, myths, narratives, and poetic detours that render visible the myriad layers of human existence, conflict, and exploits of this land. The ability of the desert landscape and light to obscure and reveal what is right there in front of us echoes the points I hope to raise in relation to photography and conflict. In the series of works I weaved through this presentation, I visited the West Bank. In every visit, the lines on the ground have been redrawn, and as the sun rises or descends, different traces are revealed. These lunar scapes appear ambiguous, as anchors of scale and location are excluded from view. The impressions on the ground, resembling drawings, sketches, or scratches, are caught between suggestive, natural, playful, and violent formations. The title in Hebrew, Rishum, could be translated into English as a drawing, a sketch, or scores of lines. In its Arabic translation, Rasem could also mean to delineate, to outline, and to mark. The title is a bit small, I hope you can see it. Hebrew and Arabic are both based upon root letters, shorashim, that through slight alterations construct different yet related meanings. So in Hebrew, Rasham, or in Arabic, Rasem, which are very similar, and they're delineated words, so Rishum, Roshem, which is impressions, etc. There highlights these similarities and opens up subtle ripples of interpretations. Hebrew always struck me as a language that's so heavily dependent on understanding the context or position from which one speaks, because the meaning of words was so slippery. Throughout this project are my returns to the complexities of my homeland, both personally and politically, and the relationship between photography, the landscape, and language. I traveled to Israel's de facto borders with its neighbors, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, but mostly I spent my time visiting the West Bank, the occupied territories of Palestine. My attempt to trace borders harbors the need to observe division and conflict at these sites, in the margins. Confronting these borders is always about how I situate myself in this landscape and in face of this history. My retracing of borders is an exploration of the quiet and enduring legacies of conflict and the historical and political forces that enable and perpetuate its normalization. This is not to say that conflict takes place quietly, but rather that my visual language considers quietness, subtleties, ambiguities, and poetics in order to question the way we see and perceive conflict. especially how living in ongoing conflict filters into the ground and into language. Ariel Aisha Zulai writes on the observing gaze that it always seeks passage through the veil of the visible to the essence of things. I attempt to linger in this passage, prolonging the journey through a multi-layered visual language. Trees, stains, and marks drawn on the ground are recurring motifs in my work, intended to tease out varied connotations, and in this way, to bring into conflict preconceptions informed by dominant ideologies. I refer to these attempts as methods of unlearning that I see as essential in order to challenge and move beyond polarized views. The experience of growing up in Israel as an Arab Jew of Kurdish descent on the one hand, and on the other, as a non-Jew Israeli of German descent, was of conflicting forces, all taking part in shaping my identity, political awareness, and art practice. The State of Israel gifted me with punctuation marks for my national identity in the form of brackets and 3 hyphens. So it appears like that, with 3 hyphens. Because in their eyes, I'm not Jewish, and Israeli national identity does not exist in the State of Israel. So the national identity is Jewish rather than Israeli. The hyphenation points at historical and political entanglements and erasures. I do wonder what my baby Milo will receive for his national identity. For example, my paternal grandfather, who was an Arab Jew, immigrated to Palestine from Kurdistan, or from North Iraq, and changed his family name. So Ariel, my surname, is an erasure of our Kurdish heritage. On my maternal side, my grandfather, who did not know of his biological father, grew up as a Christian German who served in the Wehrmacht during the Second World War. A few months before he passed away, we discovered that his biological father was Jewish, and that information was kept from him to protect him. Growing up in Israel with this identity formation meant, on the one hand, having a legacy of perpetration against the Jewish community within which I grew up. On the other hand, being an Arab Jew highlighted for me the attempts within Israel to generate a monolithic Jewish identity that is severed from the Arab identity. The conflict and clashes between East and West took many forms, but were always present in my family home. Throughout my practice, I used photography to contemplate these complex legacies, histories, and collective memories, and examine where or how I could situate myself within such forceful narratives. And I think throughout my practice, the different projects have tried to address sort of aspects of this complexity and of this identity. The sight of the agave flower towering over the landscape is the first encounter when passing the barrier to enter the West Bank from Jerusalem. Erected next to an emergency escape route, its stem must be a few meters tall. Despite its location under constant surveillance, it was able to grow undisturbed for many years. I have never been stopped at the barrier or checkpoint before, having driven through many times as an Israeli with an Israeli license plate. This privilege to move freely renders this barrier almost invisible to most Israelis. While for Palestinians living in the West Bank, it is not only visible, but utterly inaccessible. A few years later, the flower is no longer there. In its absence, I photograph again, positioning myself in different directions in the landscape to construct a fragmented view, a broken panorama of sorts. The Azaim checkpoint, the Palestinian village of Azaim, the separation wall, and the vast growing illegal Jewish settlement of Ma'ale Adumim are just over the horizon. The dictionary meaning of dispositions, which titles this work, is an inclination or tendency, the way in which things are placed or arranged, the stationing of troops ready for military action, or the power to deal with something as one pleases. I see these interpretations, see all of these interpretations feature in the work in one way or another, and in fact throughout this project, I think. The blatantly visible, yet unseen and unspoken, violent reality in which I grew up filters into all facets of Israeli life, from the landscape, vegetation, and architecture to language and culture. Not seeing is a position of privilege, the privilege to look the other way. Get distracted. Words begin to morph or go silent until they can hardly be called upon. Such is the case with the occupied territories of Palestine in the Hebrew language. To give one example, when spoken out loud in conversations and in public, it is territories, shtachim, alone. The word occupation, kibush, remains unspoken, and indeed it was slowly and persistently expelled from language and discourse, barred from public institutions and schools. The arresting sight of two large holes dug in the desert landscape invoke an immediate association with conflict. Carefully chiseled into the mountainy desert soil, it stands out from the main road leading to Jericho and the Dead Sea, where the Bedouin community of Wadi el-Katif resides. The photograph I took in 2014 revealed stains surrounding the holes, indicating the source of water, which was not visible to me when visiting the site and only emerged when printing in the darkroom later in London. The following year, rocks were placed around the holes. 2 years later, they were covered completely, gone without a trace. In 2019, a fence and a temporary observation post appeared collapsed on the slopes of where I first stood to photograph. 5 years after my first visit, the trace of the holes reappeared in the photograph as a stain on the ground. I think you can just about see it. In my last visit, no photograph was taken, but the construction of an Israeli groundwater extraction facility was well underway. In 2012, according to B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, said that the Israeli civil administration issued the Bedouin community of Wadi el-Katif demolition orders for constructions without a permit under the justification that this territory was declared a closed military zone designated for training purposes since the 80s. Military zones and water resources are key contributors to the state's violent attempts to displace the Palestinian communities in the West Bank. El Fouan in the Golan Heights is an Israeli defense force, an IDF training center built in 2019 to simulate combat on and underneath the ground. This is the image on the right. It was conceived after the war in Gaza in 2014, also known in Israel as the Operation Protective Edge, that revealed a vast network of tunnels dug by Palestinians in Gaza, or underneath the ground in Gaza. The cubes in the landscape appear mostly in bright white with some light pink and blue colors due to a manufacturing error. The day of taking the photograph, training was taking place quietly underground. The occasional tank or military vehicle, only visible by the rising dust cloud, are the few indicators of activity. Recent events impact the viewing of this image, and the alarming prospect of what previously was conducted for an imagined future conflict is now materializing with such violence in Gaza, causing huge destruction of entire neighborhoods and the death of thousands of Palestinians. The sight of El Fouan might be read by Israeli audiences as some form of reassurance for the IDF's ability to rescue the hostages in Gaza and offer some protection after the loss of confidence caused by Hamas's brutal attacks on the 7th of October. For Palestinians, I could only imagine this will be viewed as part of the regime's oppression and war machine, a stark reminder of the occupation and brutality of Israel's military actions. I say this now here to remind us of the violence that arises and the context in which it is viewed, a context that is kind of still forming and is changing as well. Ongoing conflict appears in a myriad of ways. Trees like the traces and stains I discussed partake in this and become political entities in this landscape. In the book Planted Flags, Iris Braverman explores trees that perform national agendas in Israel-Palestine. She writes, and I quote, "The pine tree is synonymous with the Zionist project of afforesting the desolate land of Israel, and the olive tree has become emblematic of the Palestinian struggle against Israel's occupation and for national independence. While the pines are fast-growing trees, the olive trees evidence long-standing presence in the landscape, therefore signifying the Palestinians' cultivation of the land over many generations. Further to this polarization of natural entities is the matter of legality of trees in serving political agenda, points Braverman. The pine trees are considered non-cultivated forests, while the olive trees are regarded as trees or fields for cultivation. Israel's use of an Ottoman legislation from the 19th century enabled the transformation of uncultivated lands into state property, thus legitimizing land grab from Palestinians through the local legal system. Rajesh Khader, who is a Palestinian author and human rights activist, wrote in his book Palestinian Walks, and I quote, "Like the olive trees, the roots of pine trees remained close to the surface, knotted and smooth like knuckles, scrambling for the same piece of ground, making it hard for them to coexist." I did not photograph pine nor olive trees. These are not pine nor olive trees. But would like to emphasize in this way the role trees and vegetation more broadly partake in conflict and become complex political entities in the landscape. The eucalyptus I began with, for example, signifies the Zionist settlement project in Palestine, while other trees evidence the long-standing cultivation of the land. I'll skip ahead and just summarize. One of the series of images of these palm trees, for example, indicates the cultivation by Palestinians in this sort of harsh, deserty, mountainous landscape, and is indicated by the sort of support structure, like the ropes that help these young trees or give them chance for survival. In the same area, I photographed these tamarack trees some years ago, where there are remains of a military post. I photographed them from different directions. So in both these images, there are two trees, in fact, and that's sort of when I realized that they are actually growing in symmetry, in total symmetry, concealing one another, basically, when shot from a certain position. So I'll just summarize, sorry. Growing up in Israel taught me that the occupation, the ongoing violence towards Palestinians, and the erasure of their history and claim for the land can remain unseen even when staring right at it. The desert landscape that is so often imagined as barren despite the myriad of traces that indicate otherwise, and photography that is so heavily framed through the practices of male photographers, have offered fertile grounds for me to operate differently. This manifests in my subtle depictions of conflict that is often shrouded by connotative layers and meanings. I use ambiguity and poetic language not to obscure the violence, but to explore valuable detours that could overcome a polarized discourse and unlearn mechanisms of systemic erasure. Conflict marks the landscape. It manifests in subtle ways, in the overlooked and incidental, in what is found on the verges. Thank you very much.